How do you advise a team like that to first start looking at optimizations and design patterns and gas golfing?
I guess, start with just asking for their story, like understanding what they care about. Because as a developer, it's easy to sort of be in a box where there is a right answer and the wrong answer, and you just need to pick the right answer, and it's obvious. In life, things are more complicated. Like, I advise some projects where they're like, "Hey, Winter, please, build us a contract. We'll pay you whatever you want, and this is the things." And as I explored their story and understood their use cases better, I actually advised them not to hire me, but to use this contract builder thing that already exists. But the first thing that I look always is actually two things. One is an embarrassing story, and another one is more practical. The first embarrassing thing is at some point when you create a hard hat project, its default settings don't enable optimizer in Solidity. So that's how I built my first project, and I was instantly hit with some size limits and some insane gas costs, and I spent too many days trying to address them until I figured out that I actually didn't have optimizer on. So that would be the first thing to turn on and let them know that, hey, this needs to be turned on. And then the second thing, which is way more practical and common, is looking at the storage. Storage has this trade-off. It's the most expensive thing on Ethereum, but it's also a very convenient thing. So there is also no right or wrong answer. You have to understand what they care about storing and what they don't care about storing, and kind of create clever and smart ways of using that space. So, very simple thing is like, if they store a bunch of data about a token, let's see if we can pack this data into something that is much smaller, right? Using tight structs and bit shifts and stuff like that. Another thing is seeing which data can live off-chain. So maybe you don't need to store, like, for example, the Merkle tree, right? Like, you don't need to store all the list of addresses, you just need to store the root of it. And then you can use cryptography to prove that this thing is part of that thing.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Devs Do Something. Today's guest is Winter, a former engineer at Facebook, now Meta, who dove headfirst into smart contract development. Winter has been prolific on Twitter and in his Web3 development journey so far. He's worked on projects for the Nouns and Loot communities, and he's also produced a lot of really interesting projects of his own, including Runes of Ethereum, ERC 1155U, and Hotchain SVG. In this episode, we talk about the benefits of building in public, gas optimization, innovating in NFTs, and how to succeed as an honest builder in Web3. Winter is legit. And if you're looking for a podcast to take your mind off of all the mania that's happened in crypto throughout the last week, this episode will do that for you. Winter brought myself and Josh back to this mindset of just building. And it was honestly really inspiring for us. So if you're looking for a little bit of inspiration, this episode will give you that. It'll give you that respite from the mania, and I think you'll enjoy it. So sit back, relax, and let us know what you think. I hope you enjoy. Are you a DAO or crypto native business with salaried employees? Or do you perhaps work for one? If so, whether you're a team of 5 or 500, your organization can save time and money by streaming salaries with Superfluid, who also happens to be the beloved producer of this podcast. With salary streaming, your management team no longer has to worry about executing multi-sig operations every month or manually executing hundreds of separate transactions to pay their team. Contributors and employees, on the other hand, get paid by the second, which, to be honest with you, is a pretty killer benefit on the receiving end. Those of us getting paid via stream can connect our wallet to the Superfluid dashboard and see our balances ticking up in real time. It's kind of mesmerizing and feels like you're being jacked 10 years in the future. When you're paid in a stream, it flows in perpetuity until your team needs to adjust compensation, which effectively puts Web3 payroll on autopilot. Salary streaming is easy to set up thanks to our recent integration with CoinShift, the leading crypto treasury management platform. In just a few clicks, you can securely set up payroll for hundreds of employees in just a single transaction, all from CoinShift's dashboard. If this sounds like something you're interested in exploring, you should visit superfluid.finance/payroll and book a salary streaming demo today. Thanks to all of our sponsors. Let's get on to the episode. All right, so we are here today with Winter. Welcome.
Hello. Good to be here.
Yes. Thanks so much for being here. People on Twitter were excited about this conversation, which was kind of fun. We're going to dive into several of your projects, your new EVM course, your thoughts on Solidity development and just development in general. You've been doing this for a little while. You've had some experience in Web 2 as well, so I'm curious to go deep on some of that stuff. But before we do that, I'd love to ask you how you got involved in crypto.
Cool. Yeah. So I learned about Bitcoin in around 2012-ish, right as I was graduating university. But at the time, it just I didn't see any value in that beyond speculation. So it was kind of a fun technological achievement. And I think I played with a video card trying to mine it, and then I discarded it. But that was my first sort of introduction into the concept. And then I basically ignored the field for 9 years. Up until summer last year, a friend reached out to me and he was interested in building an NFT. And he was like, "Hey, Winter, can you help me write a smart contract for this thing?" And I looked at similar projects and opened them on Etherscan, went to the source code, and I was just blown away. I was like, wow, this is much different and much better than I expected it to be. It has so many cool things. It has this programming model inside of it. It has consensus on top of it, so everybody knows what the latest state is. And overall, I was just fell in love in that model and couldn't give it up. So I helped my friend with the NFT project, and then kind of had an idea for another one. And then as I was exploring the space, I had basically exponential explosion of these ideas and things I wanted to build. So yeah, that's how I got started.
Nice. And so, you've obviously, you followed your interests, right? But it seems like most of your work has been concentrated around NFTs. And I love how you've been pushing the boundaries, not just like copy pasting ERC 721's different places, but you've really been an innovator with NFTs. What were some of the first NFT projects you worked on? Or maybe if there was something before some of the NFT stuff you did, I'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, I think NFTs just kind of clicked with me. I think overall the society kind of comes to understand what they are. The coins were pretty obvious, like they are one-to-one mapping with your regular currency, so it was kind of easy to get the idea. But NFTs, I feel like for most people, they just didn't make sense. We had all these jokes about right-clicking JPEGs and stuff like that. But to me, it made a lot of sense. To me, it's like, hey, there is a storage. It records who owns what. Each object is distinct, and then you can do stuff with the objects. And then it's not just the registry. It's like a dynamic code that decides who owns what. So in my case, I saw kind of interesting things you could do with it. And yeah, like basically I spent most of my time in the NFT, I guess, space. The first project was kind of simple. It was a generative art piece. To me, it seemed like a really cool application of the technology because you have an algorithm that produces some image, and then you have blockchain decide sort of the seed of that image. And that seed is kind of embedded in the token itself. And you cannot change it, you can trade it, etc. And to me, there was something magical about it. It's like also having a limit on capacity. Like many people have complaints about, it being scarce or not scarce. But to me, that is like the algorithm works in a way that like there could be no more than this many items forever. And nobody with any administrative privileges, not even Vitalik, can go in and change that. And there was something magical and novel about this that really fascinated me. So the first NFT project was Geomes. It was generative art collection. And then we kind of wanted to do more of these. And I started looking into gas optimizations because the Ethereum price was high and the sort of the gas prices overall in the market were very high. So it's like, hey, what goes into the gas price, etc. And it kind of, I embarked on this deep dive, understanding how things work, why this is more expensive than that. And, I never stopped. So that's where I am now.
Nice. Yeah. So you worked, I think, at Meta before. That's correct, right?
Yeah, I spent like 8 years there. Yeah.
Nice. Nice. Was anything when you coming from Meta and more traditional big tech, was anything difficult for you to wrap your head around when you got into the EVM and some of these things relating to blockchains themselves, or was it pretty easy to just get your head around the mental model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was really straightforward. It's like just reading about that, reading the source code, it immediately clicked. Like I know exactly what's going on. I have a mental model of how these things work, and those are not, those are not Urbit or any other sort of more sophisticated piece of technology. This is, it was kind of very straightforward. The off-putting part was like the media cycle at the time was very anti-crypto and anti-NFT, and this is all ridiculous. And then you have all these stories of people who bought random things and now they're like super rich, or people who invested all their life savings into a thing and now they're super poor. And all of that layer was kind of, you had to be consciously correcting your bias towards just ignoring that noise and looking at the core of the technology. But once you look at the core of the technology, it's actually really cool, and I feel like it's really sound and it solves the problems that haven't been solved before. So I feel like that experience in big tech helped me recognize that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's definitely been a polarizing thing. You said at the time the news cycle was kind of negative on crypto. I think it still is right now, if not more so. So okay, you obviously you did jump into the EVM though, and I'm sure there was maybe a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to the gas optimization stuff. What was it like for you just learning about the EVM and deep diving into the Ethereum virtual machine?
Yeah, so at first, I got started as everybody else with Solidity, and that was the high level programming language you use. And I feel like it's great. It has some of the defaults that are not present in other programming languages. Like, there is no memory allocation. It treats unallocated values as zeros, and a bunch of other sort of decisions that are actually very well tailored towards banking applications or this distributed finance applications. And with the time, I was like, I mentioned that I looked at my initial minting code and I was like, why is this expensive? Why does this require so much gas? And that required kind of digging deeper a little bit and looking at like what it actually does. Well, it stores values. And then I would look at, hey, the storage is actually very expensive. And at the time, it was hard for me to calculate, but I started building this intuitive model. And with time, sort of layer by layer, I kind of get deeper and deeper. It wasn't like I wasn't from the day one set up to understand it full stack, right? Like, so every time I build a project, this project has a surface area, and that surface area touches a bunch of things. And each of these things can be explored further. So I would build another project that uses that, and I would learn about other things. So, for example, as part of my investigation to the gas stuff, I built a tool that takes a transaction and logs every single operation it does, plus its gas cost, and plots it in small like histogram, saying like these operations took this much. And that to me was an extremely valuable lesson. I was like, oh, hey, I'm seeing how, I can add a bunch of unchecked here and there, but the core gas issue is because I'm storing so much data. And that sort of loops back to me having to think about how do I lay out my storage, or how do I, refactor this contract to put a bunch of data off chain instead of on chain and stuff like that. So it was always constant loop. And every time I would dig deeper and deeper. And then what brought me, I guess, to the actual EVM implementation was that I have this wild dream of running Solidity in your browser and I can expand on that as well. It started as a meme. It's like, hey, React is old school. Let's rewrite everything in Solidity. But it actually has a lot of interesting implications and use cases. So I tried using the EVM implementation from the Ethereum Foundation, but that one actually is pretty big, and fitting it into the browser is not the sort of the most pleasant task. So, and I also wanted to extend it in some ways. So I started kind of thinking about implementing my own, and then diving deeper, reading yellow paper and stuff like that. So, there was never a spot where I had this path figured out. it was always kind of exploratory iteration and digging deeper and deeper.
Okay, holy shit! So we're gonna have to come back to this Solidity in the browser thing because we need to pull on that thread. But one thing I want to ask, and this is, I guess, an observation, but it seems to me that people that have gotten really good at understanding the EVM and specifically really good at like gas golfing have found a way to build in a tight feedback loop to their process of iterating and learning what's gonna save gas and what's not, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
Josh actually might be a good person to ask this question because he's done the same thing. But I guess before I even ask a question, Josh, you've done that, right? You've tried to make the feedback loop for testing things with the EVM very tight, right? That am I correct in assuming that's part of your process?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that like you wish more people understood when it comes to like beginning to iterate with the EVM? I think you mentioned histograms in there, but is there any other tooling or useful like tips you have for people that want to begin optimizing things in terms of gas?
Yeah, I mean the number 1 and 2 tools here are definitely Remix and EVM.codes. I say Remix because you can write sort of high level Solidity and you get a lot of nice support in there, and like you can really start stepping through instructions and it shows you where you are in the Solidity code. Now EVM.code supports this to sort of a lesser degree, and I definitely don't think Remix should be your last stop, right? Like it's very much like a sort of like toy area to play with this, right? But yeah, I think it's a really good place to experiment with the high level, and then when you want to get into like the extreme low level and like what happens if I like what happens if I just mload at some arbitrary point in memory, like how does that work, what does the gas do, things like that. I think EVM.codes is really like I don't know anywhere better to try that, right? Because out of everywhere else with a debugger, like there's nowhere else that I can just jump to it and just write push one OXOO and I can just execute that immediately, right? So I think those two are definitely like the top two. I'd love to see that histogram though and play around with that a bit. And on your Solidity in the browser, I actually think that's where I originally found your work because I was like, man, this is cursed, but this is so cool. It's
nice.
It's awesome.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the Solidity in the browser idea. I know you said it started as a meme, but like how feasible is this?
Yeah, this is pretty feasible. I had a demo of this working with the Ethereum Foundation's implementation. So I guess the basic idea is like, why would you even want to do this? And here's my pitch for that. And I've sort of found it maybe a little after I initially came up with the idea. So, there is no casual relationship here. But one thing that you've probably seen Etherscan, for example, for a contract, it gives you a UI, right? Like it knows the ABI of your contract, it knows which functions it exports, so it can build you an interface, allowing you to interact with the contract. And to me, that whole idea is very appealing. It's like the contract itself is permissionless. It doesn't know or care about what UIs are built for it. You could use Uniswap from any UI, from the terminal, from anything, right? And that's a big beauty of it. But I feel like these tools, and I've seen many of them, they kind of hit this ceiling where they can show you the UI, but then it's still not useful. It's still not good enough, right? Like you cannot build Uniswap UI just based on ABI of the contract. You just can't. But if you wanted to kind of build the Uniswap UI for a Uniswap pool, you would have to, take on all of this technological complexity. There is React, there is WAGMI and a bunch of other libraries, Connect kits and Rainbow kits and things to connect your wallet. And it's just massive, right? Like this infrastructure is massive. And I know this, I worked on React from, pretty much day one when it was released, and I loved React, but I feel like it's an overkill for some of the use cases, especially when you take into account all the tooling that comes with it. Like it's just a lot of complexity. So my pitch for running EVM in the browser is building UIs for contracts that are more complicated than just, call this function or press mint, right? But that are not complicated enough that need a whole bunch of React code on top. So, you can imagine a Solidity file where you write your UI logic that says like, take input from this place, multiplied by this token price, and then create this router sort of array, and then pass this router to the Uniswap exchange, and then get these things back, etc. And I feel like that's a niche that this tool would be very useful for, building these UIs that are in the medium complexity side. And then there is another cluster of things, which is dynamic NFTs. And as I mentioned earlier, my headspace is NFT space. And I constantly think about the applications and implications of this technology. And I feel like Ethereum kind of stalled on this. Like, Ethereum is great at this innovation. NFTs first appeared on Ethereum in the widespread sort of sense. And the programming model allows you to build this NFTs from the first place. But things like Solana, for example, now they raised some money to build X NFTs, which is a dynamic type of NFT on Solana. And I'm like, why is Ethereum stalling, right? Like, is there some technological gap that will enable a lot more interesting things with NFTs? And this running Solidity in the browser could be one of them. Maybe the NFT authors will be able to add interesting UI interactions to their NFTs that is all written in Solidity, so it's all in their sort of zone of comfort zone, and doesn't require huge leaps and investments in technology. And yeah, maybe that will enable a whole bunch of new projects.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's kind of like a similar value prop that Foundry has, right? Is that you should be writing your tests in Solidity, right? Because whenever you write them in JavaScript, there's a lot of just kind of, obviously there's a lot of boilerplate, but there's a lot of like, JavaScript doesn't really support this, so you have to use a library that uses another library, and
exactly.
it spirals.
Yeah. Foundry is a really big inspiration point for this project, and specifically, I hang out in a few guilds and discords that are mostly full of experienced developers, and so much joy was there when they discovered Foundry and they started using it. It's like, hey, you no longer need to depend on not only JavaScript as a separate language, but all the tools and installation hurdles that come with it. So that was a huge relief. And this revalidated, I guess, the idea that building UI in Solidity might be a viable thing.
Right. Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense now.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, but I like this idea though, with a meme kind of propagating and getting a foot in the door, right? So now I have an opportunity to explain myself and give more context, and you're like, oh, hey, maybe that's more interesting. So that's kind of cool. Yeah,
and maybe one more quick thing before we wrap up this topic. Actually, on a similar note. So somebody, we actually had him on the podcast recently. Dawson's the guy's name. I think it's Daws.eth. But we actually in at DevCon, we met up and we were talking a little bit, and he's like, dude, so Foundry can do FFI, right? Why don't we just do server side Solidity? I know it's totally we shouldn't do this at all, but it's I don't know, maybe one day we'll just have the entire stack is just in Solidity, right? We could have a front end in Solidity, back end in Solidity, smart contracts, all of it. It's
and and people will hate Solidity for all the complications and tooling, the way people hate it in JavaScript right now, right? It's gonna, if it's successful, it's gonna reach this cycle again. But that's fun if it helps somebody to build the backend things in Solidity and use FFI. Sure,
history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? Solidity is a new JavaScript.
Well, we'll see.
We definitely will. No, I'm with you guys on the, hopefully we can have just more Web3 native tool chains, right? Instead of having to rely on a bunch of React and JavaScript things. So I'm with you there. So you mentioned some of the things that Solana is doing around dynamic NFTs. Winter, you're big on SVGs on chain and actually putting token data on chain instead of relying on just a standard URL to point to in the token URI. How important do you think it is to put all of that data on chain? Do you think we're at risk right now? And I've seen you tweet a little bit about this, but do you think we're at risk right now of the NFT space just being too centralized, permanently? Do you think we need to put more data on chain? How do you view this tension between the convenience of OpenSea and actual decentralization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think regarding decentralization, whatever the data is on chain or off chain doesn't really matter in some way, and I'll explain a little more about this. But I feel like the most important part of this is that the part that you mentioned is OpenSea, right? The technology is open and available, and it's decentralized under the hood, but there are things like wallets and marketplaces, including OpenSea, that kind of gained a huge portion of the market. And now, as an NFT creator, I'm not only working against the NFT specification, which is permissionless, it's published and it's there. I'm also working against OpenSea and other marketplaces. So, for example, one of the projects I worked on, which is pushing that boundary watch faces, it stores everything on chain and it generates the image dynamically on chain. So when you transfer things over, like it reads the latest data and the image is always up to date. But a big challenge of that was actually making sure that it renders properly on OpenSea, right? Technically, the token URI was correct and up to the standard, but OpenSea has a preview with the specific size, which spec doesn't show anything about. And we spent quite a bit of time trying to make sure that it works pretty in OpenSea, because now all the wallets and a bunch of other things oftentimes use OpenSea's APIs to display the metadata. They don't fetch the metadata themselves, they talk to this API server. So to me, the centralization aspect of it is not about the on-chain or off-chain. It's more about like this, having these gigantic whales in the universe of API that basically centralize access to things. And you could think the same way about like Infura or Alchemy, right? Like they occupied a lot of market and mind share. So to the point where new developers, they just think that's how you interact with Ethereum network, is like you have to create an Infura account or Alchemy account, which is not true, right? Like you could use pretty much any service provider. So yeah, I'm a little concerned about decentralization in that space, and it reminds me of the browser wars of 90s and 2000s, where not only you have to build your website, but you also need to make sure that your website works great on Firefox, Internet Explorer, Opera, and a bunch of other browsers. And it's not a trivial task. And it, with the Google advancement and WebKit and other things, you can see that now there is spec and there is also WebKit, and these things you don't know which one is primary, because they kind of influence each other so much, and Google owns so much of the web mindshare that's the centralization that I'm concerned about. And in regards of storing stuff on chain, I feel like it's a very clever technological achievement. It's very non-trivial to do that, right? So if it was easy, everybody would do that. So when you look at the projects that are on chain, you kind of know that they are next level in a way, right? Like they're apart from other projects because the developers actually put 10 times more effort to making it run on chain, and that's a non-trivial thing. Another aspect that I love is that my long bet is that Ethereum will become the foundation for the financial system in the global world, and in that case, the block space itself will become more and more expensive. So projects that are currently on chain, they kind of cement themselves like I had this analogy with the Central Park in New York City, right? Like they occupy that part and they create something beautiful, and that block space is already there and it's not going to go away. So there is something of the permanence of it that I think is cool. It's also cool because I run a local node at my home, and I know that parts of my projects live on that node, which is also sounds really cool. But to the consumer, it's really hard to explain the benefits of this. And I feel like the market didn't really price in the on-chain or off-chain aspect of projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think some people think about it, but I think it also it does matter, right? Block space, if we're all right, block space is going to become increasingly valuable, and to occupy a piece of that is a powerful thing.
And also like a notion of running something forever. I had this before discovering Ethereum, I had this sort of a puzzle that I always struggled. I constantly built side projects, and some of them died, some of them were pretty successful. But to me, it's like the ultimate puzzle was like, how do I make something that can outlive me, right? Like if I lose my credit card or, decide to call it quits and move to, Latin America or something like that. And, my AWS will expire. My Heroku instances will eventually sort of run out of budget, etc. And Ethereum is the only thing so far that I know that kind of funds itself. So you can build projects that outlive you or anyone else. And building projects on chain has this property where like watch faces or any other projects that live there, they will live there forever. And you don't have to worry about your credit card being expired or your pinata not being pinned anymore, right?
Totally. No, it's very cool. You mentioned though that putting everything on chain is hard, right? It requires a level of skill that not everybody has,
right?
So one question I wanted to ask you, this is like a little bit related to like actually leveling up as a developer and just being a good developer in general. But like, let's say you're advising an NFT project team who really, they have like basic level Solidity skills, right? They haven't done any gas optimization. They've just done kind of like a first iteration of a contract. And before they decide to deploy it, they come to you and they say, hey, Winter, can you look at this? You obviously have a lot of skill. What do you think? What do you think we should do? How do you advise a team like that to first start looking at optimizations and design patterns and gas golfing?
Right. That's a great question. I guess start with just, asking for their story, like understanding what they care about. Because as a developer, it's easy to sort of be in a box where there is a right answer and the wrong answer, and you just need to pick the right answer, and it's obvious. In life, things are more complicated. Like I advise some projects where they're like, "Hey, Winter, please, build us a contract. We'll pay you whatever you want, and this is the things." And as I explored their story and understood their use cases better, I actually advised them not to hire me, but to use this contract builder thing that already exists. And in these cases, like I love kind of digging into the story and why people care about these things. And there is a famous story of Yuga Labs that just don't care about gas too much, and the people still pay these high prices, and it's fine, right? So maybe for them it just doesn't matter. So you have to understand what people care about and kind of align the technology towards that what they care about. But assuming they care about same things and they want the project in the interest of community, and they want it to be efficient, and they wanted to sort of generate positive emotions and not be too expensive on minting perspective, etc. The first thing that I look always is actually two things. One is an embarrassing story, and another one is more practical. The first embarrassing thing is at some point when you create a hard hat project, its default settings don't enable optimizer in Solidity. So that's how I built my first project, and I was instantly hit with some size limits and some insane gas costs, and I spent too many days trying to address them until I figured out that I actually didn't have optimizer on. So that would be the first thing to turn on and let them know that, hey, this needs to be turned on, so that they get a realistic sort of assessment of what things are. And then the second thing, which is way more practical and common, is looking at the storage. Storage has this trade-off. It's the most expensive thing on Ethereum, but it's also a very convenient thing. So there is also no right or wrong answer. You have to understand what they care about storing and what they don't care about storing, and kind of create clever and smart ways of using that space. So very simple thing is like, if they store a bunch of data about a token, let's see if we can pack this data into something that is much smaller, right? Using tight structs and bit shifts and stuff like that. Another thing is seeing which data can live off chain. So maybe you don't need to store, like, for example, the Merkle tree, right? Like you don't need to store all the list of addresses, you just need to store the root of it. And then you can use cryptography to prove that this thing is part of that thing. So things like that, settings, then evaluating storage, and then understanding sort of, I guess, other lower opportunities. But the storage part basically outweighs everything else that they do. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good advice. It's good to look for the 80% of things, or the 20% of things that will have 80% of the impact. And
Right.
looking at storage is a good example of that. What about security? How do you personally look at smart contract security?
Yeah, security is scary. Like, coming from the Web 2 background and building a lot of backend systems back in the day, it's, backend is something you can always change. You can always submit a patch, submit a thing, mitigate, migrate data. If your data is lost, you can like recover it from a backup and stuff like that. So there is a lot of safety guards. But Ethereum model is different. Ethereum model, usually you have an immutable contract that once deployed, it's just there. You cannot change it. There is upgraded story, but that's separate. And then another thing is, the values. The value, the money is basically a primitive data type on Ethereum, unlike Web 3 or unlike Web 2, where you would have a token from Stripe or something like that. So it's actually very scary, and I think I spend like 80% of my time when I build a smart contract on testing and understanding kind of how it runs. So for one of the projects, Rings for Loot, I remember I spent maybe north of 90% on writing tests, comprehensive tests that like test all different scenarios and stuff. So that's a lot of time thinking about this stuff. But then another super useful thing that I've done before is I asked my friends who are also Solidity developers to take a look at my contract. And it's actually very surprising how many things we kind of don't notice if we work on our own thing. And then you show it to somebody else, and it's not even a full-fledged audit or anything like that. But they are able to sort of pattern match some things and notice things that you don't notice. So definitely showing this to other people is a very good idea. And then last thing that I wanted to mention in this kind of smart contract security field is that many crypto complaints or criticism comes from these hacks and things where people lost their money, and that is painted as a terrible thing. When I look at this, I think this is brilliant. I think the model that Ethereum has right now, even with the hacks, is still really, really awesome. Because the alternative, I've lived through the alternatives in many big companies. They have this security team that takes 6 months to kind of get on their waiting list, and then they kind of show up and they do some stuff, and there are some tasks, and it's a very mundane process. There is open HackerOne thing where people can submit vulnerabilities, but that usually becomes very spammy and the rewards are not that big. But if you look at crypto, it's basically unbounded bounty program that runs all the time, 24/7, and incentive structure is built in a way where if you have an exploit, you really want to use that exploit ASAP because somebody else can find exploit sooner and get all the money. So when I see all these expensive hacks, I think this is great. I think hey, the future systems will just not have this bug, and basically the system becomes anti-fragile, where it hardens as people attack it. And then, within 10 years, if you continue doing that, the chance of finding a new vulnerability that wasn't found before actually goes down quite a bit. And you have this probabilistic insurance of sort that, this system works, especially if you compare it to the alternatives that we have right now.
Yeah, I agree. I don't remember who it was that said this, but they said, any protocol that stores tokens is basically a non-consensual bug bounty, right? And it's, it's funny, but I think it's very much true that, like you said, you basically you force so many people into writing better code and writing better tests and, being able to reason about what they're doing and really simplifying, right?
Mm-hmm.
I come to think of it, I don't think I ever wrote any serious tests before smart contracts, right? Because it's like you mentioned, right? If you push a bug to, let's say, a mobile app, right? Okay, we'll just rebuild the thing, maybe 20 minutes, and then just push the push the difference, right? Push the new version of it, and everything's fine. And again, like, people could sit on these vulnerabilities for a long time, right? Like whenever we see these like CVEs that, like, I think OpenSSL just there's like a big critical vulnerability that was like just patched either today or maybe it's going to be tomorrow that the patch comes out, right? But like that 0-day could have been around for years, right? Somebody could have found that years ago and have just sat on it. Whereas in a smart contract, like as soon as you find it, like even on the white hat side, right? Obviously, I haven't been on the sort of black hat side of this, but even on the white hat side, like I find a vulnerability, I'm like, oh my god, I need to like get on the phone with them right now, right? Because it could be literally any second that somebody else has also found that. So yeah, I think in that regard, it does really force you to like think deeply about security and act as fast as possible.
Right, and to this point, the tokens that go up in price really high or really low, right? Like they contribute to this hardening of things. So like you can complain about the speculation and all these things that go to the moon and then crash, but in my mind it's like, hey, if a contract holds this many tokens and their value like becomes 1,000 or 1,000,000 times more, well, the hackers are now more likely to look and scrutinize this contract and find vulnerabilities and stuff like that. So it hardens the system even further.
Yeah, the analogy to like an anti-fragile system, I think, is actually kind of an interesting one. There's no like traditional technology or big tech version of the Samsung U up text, right? Like no one's gonna take, like, if you get a text from someone like Samsung or like someone else in the space who is a white hat, like you do get on that immediately. There's no 6-month review process, right? It's immediate. It's immediate.
Yep.
Great advice. So one question we get a lot from people that listen to the show or that we talk to about the show is, they want to understand how to level up as a Solidity developer, right? They want to know how our guests approach their own development. And I guess one thing I just love to ask you is, like, what have you personally done to level up as an engineer throughout your career? I mean, I think it'd just be good to ask you in general. I'm curious.
Yep. I guess the first thing before you even start this, it's important to understand what drives you, and your learning style. And I've given this advice to many people the way I learn things, and it just doesn't work for some, right? Like some people have a different motivation, or they have different things that excite them. And I feel like the older you get, or the more you progress, it's even more important to understand what is your learning style, how do you learn better, right? And my case, I learned through building. So it's much easier for me to learn something if I'm either rebuilding it from scratch or using it. I like videos and I like other content that is like on the periphery, but I almost treat it as a very low value thing that just is put in the box that sometimes can produce an interesting idea. But having learned these things about myself now helps me kind of up level even faster because I know what drives me. So and it's kind of hard question to answer even for yourself if you would think about like what drives me. And many people who sign up for the EVM course, and the first question I ask them is like, why do you want to do this? And some people actually struggle. They're like, oh, I'm curious and I just want to learn things, and that just doesn't strike me as a strong motivation. And it's a almost like 100% correlation that these people drop off faster. They're like, the life came up and I needed to do this or that, and it's totally understandable. But at the same time, it's like, hey, you could have spent that time actually doing something that moves you forward. So that understanding is important. And then it's also important to be in the community of people who push you forward. When you're at a job, for example, and you want to get better at something, there are two ways actually. One is you could, spend your free time watching videos or going to conferences and learning about stuff. But that is just not going to work. I did that in my previous career, or like in the past. I used to build desktop apps in some programming languages for corporate stuff, and I dreamed of building iPhone apps, and I would read their documentation, watch their talks, but that was kind of low outcome. And then I quit my desktop building job and found a startup that paid like 30% of my salary, but I was basically in the mix of it. The expectation was that I would exercise these skills, and that basically skyrocketed my trajectory, because I felt like, every day I came in and I'm stretched. I need to learn these things to make progress for my work stuff, and in that environment you learn just so much faster. So you can think of it as like, hey, if you want to learn piano, right? Like, would you learn faster if you did it on the weekends, or would you learn faster if you sign up for a band and you have, a concert coming up in a month, right? Like, when the thing becomes a tool and means to an end, you end up mastering it much faster because you're really motivated. So that's my super general advice. And then if you're already a senior engineer and you work in tech and you kind of want to learn stuff, I highly recommend buying books, courses, videos, etc. If you look at the prices, they're really cheap compared to your hourly rate, and the value you get from it is much higher. Like, even if that course has materials mostly found online and compiled, it's still, there is a lot of value in having that sequence presented to you versus you doing your own research and spending many more hours kind of assembling it. So once you have the means, I definitely highly recommend just purchasing good materials and up leveling this way.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I've always found that for myself as well, that whenever I'm in a situation where I have to learn the thing, I definitely get better at it. Whereas everything else where I tell myself I'm going to do something on the side, it's hit or miss, right? It's definitely not reliable. So I definitely relate to that big time. Big time. Tell us about the EVM course. You mentioned the EVM course. People, when I asked, them what I should ask you, they asked about the EVM course. So can you introduce our listeners to what that is and provide some color?
It all started from my previous idea with implementing EVM for the browser so that you could do fun things. And as I was working through that, I noticed that the hardest part is not implementation. The implementation is actually really straightforward. The EVM itself is beautifully, elegantly simple and powerful. And what's hard is actually coming up with unit tests and figuring out what needs to happen exactly and like which edge cases to test was a lot of time. So I think I've spent like 2 weeks working on the EVM implementation in TypeScript, and I've noticed that like I wanted to refactor it, and as I did with unit tests, it was joy. It was such a fun experience because all the unit tests are already were written, and I would just make one thing at a time. So like it would start with a simple opcode parsing, and then it works, and then it's like implement push, and then implement pop, and then like going through that is just it has this flow state almost enforced on you where like you don't have to think too much on what to do. You have exactly a thing in front of you, and then it gives you a sense of progress. So as I was working on that, I had an idea of like, hey, maybe, if I found this valuable, maybe other people will find this valuable too. So I posted it on Firecaster and found my first batch of like 20 people who signed up and went through the course. And, some of them dropped out, some of them actually went to the end. But it's such a joy for me to kind of come into the Discord server where we coordinate these things and see their progress, right? They post this thing and it's like, I managed to squeeze this in 15 minutes break today, and it was so much fun. Like I get 3 tests running, and I feel like if people have this emotion, that the experience of joy and happiness when they implement this very complex technical thing, it's just a better thing for the world, where like more people will understand EVM, and more interesting application will come out of it. Because when I found EVM and seeing the projects that I built, well, we're not even stretching it so far, right? Like we're not pushing the boundaries of what EVM can do yet. So yeah, so that's the course. It's still not released because I'm still working on making it much smoother. Yeah, I hope to publish it sometime in this month.
I love it. There's a landing page, right, at EVMcourse.com. Is that right?
Yes, correct. I didn't want to turn this into a shill-in session. This course is not for everyone, etc. But if you're interested, definitely sign up. I'll send you an email when it's ready, and I'll also try to explain as much as I can who this course is for and who this course is not for. Because the last thing I want is to like overpromise and sell you something that you don't really need, right? And that's the thing about like the whole ethical building in Web3 that I can talk about later. where a lot of projects nowadays out there, they're very upfront of like, hey, buy this or you'll miss out. And I guarantee you about the EVM course, you'll not miss out. Like it's always going to be there, and I'll always going to be improving it. So hopefully there is no FOMO on that front.
Yeah, no, there's definitely people listening that I think would just like it. So it's good that we talked about it for a little bit. And I also like your thought process on having things clearly laid out that you can work on instead of having to like also at the same time decide what to work on or what to practice. I think that's actually a good insight. That's really what you pay for, I think, when you're paying for a course.
Yep.
I'm with you there. So you mentioned a second ago this thing some of us builders have in Web3 where it's kind of like marketing feels a little off to us. We don't love it. I've worked like in sales and stuff, so I'm a little more comfortable with it. Like I came to the more technical side of things a little bit later, actually, after I learned like just some basic business stuff. But I can definitely relate to that sentiment of, this space has a lot of shills, a lot of sleazy marketing, and a lot of just stuff that I don't think is always great behavior. I've seen you put out some content on this about how you've kind of navigated this sort of thing, and I'd love for you to expand on it here because I think you have some really interesting insights.
Yeah, thank you. And like that was one of the most favorited and retweeted tweet I think that I posted in the last 6 months or so. So felt like it definitely resonated with people. In that, I said that honest builders or ethical builders in Web3 in the current market are at severe disadvantage because they just don't do what other projects do to sort of attract customers. They hate shilling, they hate marketing overall. They don't employ any sketchiness or like token rewards or any other things that kind of inflict the value of the project. They definitely don't want to overpromise things or publish a roadmap and then just don't stick to it. It gives them a lot of anxiety for not delivering on their promise or letting people down. And then these other people that the culture has formed in Web3, where like people always look for rugs and take their every opportunity to sort of complain and introduce some fear in the community about the project. And like ethical builders usually take it to heart and it makes them super stressed. And I know this from my personal experience. I feel like I'm in this category. I'm also in a few communities that are in the same category, like super talented, very cool developers, designers, builders, marketers that all feel kind of like uneasy with the current narratives that get popular in Web3. And that's very discomforting. And I have a few comments. Like after posting that, I think I've developed a few things that kind of expanded on that thought process. And one is that the noise you hear is usually the promoted noise, and that by definition is going to be have a shill vibes to it, because that's how the information propagates and that's how it works. So kind of you have to consciously overcorrect for that and know that people who used marketing agency or the sold account or like Twitter account that have thousands of followers, they like the types of projects they promote are usually not the type of projects that you want to work on. Then the other thing that I've learned is that there is a concept of non-coercive marketing, and it's a new thing. If you just Google non-coercive marketing, you will find a bunch of articles by this person who kind of discovered the same thing, which is like they knew about marketing and how it works and funnels and numbers and conversion rates, and it all felt wrong for them. And instead they kind of created this memo where they treat the customer as a whole. Like customer doesn't need your product really. They are good as they are. You don't need to like provide limited time deals or in any other ways trying to coerce them into buying your thing. But instead, you're just being very sincere and trying to build a trustful relationship. And if there is a time that is right when they want to purchase this thing, that will come out naturally. But you just kind of give up control on that. And to me, it really resonated. I felt like that's my style and that's how I feel about building projects. So, I'm employing that. Another advice that I've seen and I've given to people, I guess, is that you don't have to build something that has a 10K PFP and immediately successful. Like if you start with something really small that has like NFT collection of 3 or 5, and or a small project that targets like a tiny community, you will find your customers, and these customers will give you some positive emotions and some reassurance. So when you just don't have to, you don't need to compare yourself to this spam 10K PFP projects that flooded the internet 6 months ago, right? You can, there is definitely a lot of room for authentic builders who can build stuff for a small community at first, and then you kind of scale it up a little bit by a little bit. But I feel like maybe financially you are less likely to have amazing outcome if you don't employ these tactics. But at the same time, in the long run, you will definitely be ahead just by feeling great about your work, by having people who really care about your work. And that's way more valuable than like the immediate bottom line that you draw on your project. So I feel like the honest builders and ethical builders in Web3 actually have an edge. They just haven't discovered it yet.
Yeah. I think there's definitely something to be said for these grassroots teams that, or even just people, right? That, they just come along and there's not really much intention to, sell a thing or, be the next, like $1 billion startup, right? They want to build something that they want to see. And, I don't know, there's something that like really works with that and really really resonates with, a lot of, especially the developer community, but, the crypto community in general.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
that's what all this is, right? Is like decentralize and like, let individuals kind of, let individuals kind of like try to take control and do their own thing, right? And I love that about this space. You see it in other places in technology as well, but I haven't seen it as like common as I see it in crypto.
For sure. And you just cannot fake it. Like if you're having lots of fun time building something, like it will come through in many ways, in many factors. But and that's the edge I think that the ethical builders have, is that like they have this unfakeable intrinsic desire to build things that haven't been built before, and they take a lot of pride and joy in building these things. So whatever the marketing of big companies, they will not be able to replicate the same thing. So definitely use that edge. Yeah.
Totally. A couple other questions for you before we wrap up today. I know we're coming up on time a little bit, but one thing we also like to ask everyone who comes on is whether or not you have any favorite optimizations or design patterns that you've implemented in one of your projects that you'd love to call out that you're particularly proud of. We sent you over a doc with some questions on it. It looks like you have a couple. I'd love for you to expand on what those are.
Yeah. I was, I can't say I'm proud of, like, when I discovered these things, I find them amusing, but that's not something that I would put in my resume or say like, I'm the author of this idea. It's just, but I was thinking about this question, I guess, for a good part of the week after you've sent it. And I have a few. So one thing that I really enjoyed working on is the ERC 1155U. And that was for one of the collections that I've made. And I felt like I've done, like I've made almost GAS optimal NFT implementation that still kind of confirms to these things. It's using 1155 instead of 721 because 1155 allows you to get away with just with less storage. So it's just one SS store, and it also can hold a bunch of extra data that packs in the space that is not used by your address as an owner of the token. So I felt like that was a very satisfying way of discovering basically the bare bones implementation. And when I posted about it, I found another person who kind of reached very similar conclusions, maybe a month earlier than me, that I haven't seen. And that was kind of fun. It was like we found this thing and we thought really deeply about the storage. Another thing that was really fun was rings for loot. That one is a permissionless mint, fully on chain, and it basically encoded a very sophisticated supply of rings in the binary data and in the very compressed format that I remember working really hard on getting it right. And that was a very sophisticated project. And the last thing that I want to mention is not my invention, but things that I feel like is underutilized specifically in the NFT space is signed mints. So you've seen, how people get on the allow list by submitting their address. Some projects implemented by using Merkle trees or putting the addresses on chain, and all of that stuff is really expensive and it's very inflexible. And NFT minting, like in the project's lifecycle, if the project has a limited supply, that takes only a small percentage of time, right? And everything else that happens to the project is after that. So I feel like a technique that is underutilized is signed mints, where you have a private key on the server that doesn't have any funds, but it signs the mint request. And then the contract can verify that the minting call was signed by the trusted server. And that allows the contract to trust things like price or token ID or other things, which means that, you could give a discount for somebody, or you could change the logic of minting, or you could burn that wallet and essentially limit the supply at what it is right now. So I feel like the signed mints approach is pretty underutilized in the space, and it saves a ton of gas because you don't need to store pretty much anything on chain. So those are three things.
Nice. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that signed mints approach. We'll have to get links. You have to send us links to like a repo for each of those things. We can link them in our show notes because I think people will want to go check them out. Okay, couple more here. Actually, there's one or two that I forgot. One thing that I was personally curious about is, coming from the traditional, like I said, big tech world. You worked at Meta. What do some of your friends that are still working at Meta or other places in San Francisco in traditional technology, what do they think of what we're doing? Are they curious about it? Are they like, wow, this stuff is the work of the devil, like some people seem to think? What's your take on how they see this industry?
Yeah, I guess most of my friends who still work in big tech, they're pretty much Hacker News piled, and Hacker News is relatively anti-crypto, and that's basically their whole exposure. Is they read these things, read the media, and they're like, oh, this is a scam. And then I mentioned to a few people that, hey, I've built a few NFT projects, and they're like, are you rich or are you a scammer? Neither of these things, and they just don't see it. And I was thinking about this for a long time. It's like, why are they slipping on Ethereum and everything that happens in blockchain? And I feel like I have a theory actually, and that has to do with just getting old. People who are in my circle in Facebook or other places, they are senior staff plus engineers who have been in the industry for 10 years or more, and they have seen these cycles. They have seen a framework come up, gain popularity, die down, another framework come up, gain popularity, die down, and they've been on some of these rides. Some of them have been huge Ruby on Rails fans and drove this train up and down. Some were huge React fans, or Backbone, or there are many frameworks and things in this, or no SQL databases, right? They've seen these cycles, and after having seen many of these cycles, you kind of it's very hard to not get cynical, and they get cynical. They look at this stuff as oh well, another database that is super expensive to write to, just use Postgres or whatever, and they basically dismiss the idea, and they don't have even energy to look into this stuff. They they have their bills to pay, they have their job to do, and a lot of what involves in big tech right now, maybe it's going to change soon, but hosting or creating a visibility of action that the company can recognize, and that just doesn't lend itself into a mindset that will allow you to sort of appreciate these things and kind of dive deeper in them. However, there are some people who have experienced all that, but then, like myself, had an opportunity to sort of pierce through that skepticism and cynicism and just look at the tech. And what I have discovered was very similar to how I discovered computing and internet. And it just feels fun. It feels like something very novel in many ways that is hard to explain to other people. And back in the day, internet was really hard to explain to people. I remember trying to do that for my grandma, and I just failed. I couldn't she couldn't comprehend it. And I feel like in crypto, it's kind of similar, where like there is a bubble of people who understand it, there is a larger bubble of people who speculate on it, and then there is a gigantic bubble of people who have no idea and have no understanding. And yeah, once I discovered that, I found a lot of parallels. I found a bunch of super smart people who work in the space and have utmost respect for them and look up to them. And yeah, stayed up late, deploying contracts, waiting for the gas fees to go down. Like reminded me using the internet in the early days where the internet was really, really expensive, and I had to wait until midnight because there was some discount on that. And like these things kind of resonated, and I see it, and I want to be in this space for this, because I know that this time won't last forever, right? Like once it's productionalized and taken over big corps, it's just not going to be as fun anymore. So I feel like this is a still golden time in this industry.
I love that. How about on the other side, right? How about for the people that are very crypto native, that are on board? They're like, this is the coolest thing ever, right? They feel just like you, but they don't have the experience in technology that you have, where you have seen some of these cycles, right? You're not cynical, which is good. Kudos to you. But you have seen things rise and fall. What do you think that most people that are like the crypto native types, what do you think they don't understand?
Well, they don't understand that like a lot of like the technology merits and its success are not super correlated. They are correlated, but they're not. It's not causation, right? Like something succeeds not because it's a superior technology. It succeeds because of all sorts of random reasons, and fail for the same thing. And it's kind of a failure to think that, oh, hey, this technology is superior, therefore it must be more valuable and it's definitely going to win. I don't think that's the case. Looking at like how the cycles go is like usually there is a cycle that creates a lot of monetary value, and then that spawns a lot of VC interest, that spawns a lot of companies that hire a lot of devs, and this has a huge momentum. And these devs like are working through the bear market because that's the momentum that brought them in here, and they will work on this for like a couple of years, but there is really no guarantee of success. Like there are many factors outside of the technology control that will not you can't predict whatever it's going to be true or false, right? And many people try to make these predictions of like, where is our industry going to be in 10 years? Like this is so exciting, everything is going to be distributed, etc. And I always remember this advertisement from 1960s of like, hey, in 1990s we're going to have flying cars and going to be living on Mars and things like that. And it's just very natural for the human being to like take the experience they have right now and their experience from yesterday and kind of extrapolate linearly forward and say like, oh, this is where the future is. Versus the way technology and everything else works is that it's usually very sublinear, right? Like it's exponential or it's decaying exponentially. And these changes you just cannot predict and you cannot orient yourself well. So I feel like people who are excited about crypto, definitely use that excitement to learn more, to like get your skills more valuable, to dive deeper, to dig deeper, to create some novel stuff. But also keep in mind that things will fail. Like there is a very high chance that this is not going to work out. So stick with it if you're having fun, and if you feel like that gives you energy to learn more. And and don't hold your breath if this turns out to be zero value in the long run. Like that is a real possibility.
I love it. Some high quality grounded advice right there. But if you're having fun, it's still all worth it. That's good.
Exactly. You're like, as long as you're learning, that's still worth it.
Totally. Last question for you, and this gets into some of what you just said, but you mentioned it's tough to tell where anything goes in 10 years. But what do you hope our industry looks like in 10 years? We like to ask everyone this is kind of the final question. I'd love your take on that as well.
Yeah, I hope that Ethereum or something like Ethereum that has the same values and same ethos becomes a foundation for a lot of things in the world, including finance, governance, and other things. And in the success case, people would not even know they're using Ethereum or anything like that. They would not have to know or care. it would just be, how nowadays people go on Facebook without knowing anything about internet service providers or protocols or HTTPS or, anything like that. They just I go to my Facebook. And I feel like, a success for crypto in 10 years that I'm betting on is, it becoming this railroad system for the world to transact and do finance, that most people will not be familiar with, or will not need to know too much about. But as a devs, we would have a very good overview and insight into things, and we will be able to have an outsized impact on the world just by building better system, by improving things, by making contracts more secure, finding vulnerabilities, coming up with new programming languages, running EVM on the browser, or letting everyone implement their own EVM, or what have you, right? Any contribution in that space, if that technology becomes a foundation, is going to be a net positive for the world.
I love it. That's a fantastic answer. So, Winter, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you online? Where would you like to point people?
Yeah, just my Twitter, I guess. That's where I hang out. That's what I'm having most fun. So my DMs are also open. So if you just want to drop a few lines, feel free to. I try to answer everybody every time. So yeah.
I love it. We'll put a link to your Twitter account in the show notes. But yeah, no, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a fantastic episode. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Cool. Yeah, I had so much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, man.